The pianist's melody faltered, dissolving into silence, as if even the music recognized authority when it entered the room. Conversations faded mid-sentence. Forks clinked once, then stilled. All eyes shifted toward the entrance, where Connor King stepped through the glass doors like a man born into the kind of presence others spend their lives trying to imitate. He moved with quiet precision, every stride measured, his midnight suit tailored to perfection. The overhead lights caught the faint sheen on his caramel-toned skin, the gleam of his cufflinks, the calm strength in his posture. At 33, Connor had already become a name that carried weight in Chicago's business circles, the prodigy CEO of King Enterprises, a man whose confidence came not from arrogance, but from certainty. Yet in that moment, as his gaze swept the dining room, none of that power mattered. It vanished the second he found her. Vicky looked up from her menu and a soft smile bloomed across her face. For the first time all evening, warmth filled the air around her. Connor's expression melted into affection, the kind that rewrote every assumption in the room. He approached her table with easy grace, unbothered by the stares that followed. When he reached her, he bent down and kissed her cheek. "Sorry I'm late, Mom," he said, his voice rich and steady, carrying across the room like a revelation. Every sound disappeared. The champagne bubbles seemed to freeze in the glasses. The couple by the window stopped pretending not to look, and Claire, still holding her tray near the bar, went rigid. Her fingers tightened around the stemware, her knuckles whitening as reality dawned like a slow, merciless sunrise. Connor pulled out the chair across from Vicky and sat, unhurried. The ease between them was undeniable, the gentle teasing in his smile, the calm pride in her eyes. "You didn't have to come here," he murmured, and she laughed softly. "I wanted to see the place myself," she replied, her tone deliberate. Around them the whispers began again, this time threaded with awe instead of doubt. At the back of the room, Marcus exchanged a look with the maître d'. Recognition rippled through the staff, the name, the reservation, the truth. Claire's tray trembled in her grip, glass rattling against glass. The realization cut deeper than humiliation. It was exposure. The woman she had dismissed wasn't just someone's mother. She was his. And in a single sentence, every judgment Claire had made burned to ash. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sound of the city beyond the glass, honking horns, distant laughter, felt like another world entirely. Inside Le Vieux Jardin, time had frozen. Marcus stood near the host's podium, his jaw slack, his tablet still glowing with the reservation that had started it all. The busboy Eli stood motionless by the service station, his polishing cloth suspended mid-air. Even the pianist had lifted his hands from the keys, the unfinished melody dissolving into silence. Connor leaned back in his chair, one arm resting casually along the back of it, his composure effortless but unmistakably commanding. "I hope my mother's been treated well," he said, his tone low yet sharp enough to cut through the thick air. It wasn't a question. It was a statement that dared anyone to lie. Marcus's throat tightened. He looked toward Claire, whose face had drained of color. Her fingers clutched the tray to her chest like a lifeline, her lips parting and closing without sound. She wanted to speak, to twist the story, to find some explanation that would make her cruelty vanish, but the truth had already filled the room, heavier than shame. No one looked at her directly, yet she felt every pair of eyes burn into her. The guests who had watched her dismiss Vicky now looked away, unable to face what they'd silently condoned. A man at the corner table muttered something under his breath, an apology that wasn't meant for Vicky, but for his own cowardice. Vicky herself didn't move. She sat tall, her spine straight, her hands folded neatly on the linen before her. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence spoke louder than anger ever could. Dignity radiated from her in quiet waves, the kind that doesn't demand attention but commands it anyway. She met no one's gaze, not even her son's. There was power in her restraint, a lesson unfolding for everyone present. Connor's eyes didn't waver from Claire. "Good," he said finally, his voice dropping to something that felt both gentle and devastating. "Because she deserves nothing less." The silence that followed was electric, humbling and alive. Claire swallowed hard, her chest rising with the weight of realization that this moment would follow her long after the night ended. And as Marcus turned to direct the staff back into motion, the illusion of elegance that once wrapped Le Vieux Jardin had cracked. What filled its place was something far rarer. Truth laid bare beneath chandeliers. Connor didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The stillness around him was its own amplification. Every word he spoke carried the weight of quiet authority, not the kind born of wealth, but of certainty. "You're Claire, right?" he asked, his tone almost conversational. The question floated in the air, soft but unyielding. Claire's throat tightened. Yes, sir," she managed, her voice barely audible. "I thought so," he said, nodding slightly, as if confirming something he already knew. "I believe we fund your scholarship program for hospitality training." His eyes didn't leave hers. "I'd hoped it taught empathy." The sentence sliced through the silence, each word deliberate, measured, sharp as glass. There was no venom in his tone, just truth, which was somehow worse. Claire's eyes widened, the blood draining from her face. Around them, the restaurant had gone still again. Every guest, every server, every flickering candle seemed to hold its breath. Marcus took an instinctive step forward, ready to intervene, but Connor lifted a hand, calm, firm. "No," he said quietly. "Let her listen." The air thickened. Connor's gaze stayed steady, unwavering, not cruel, but resolute. "Because tonight wasn't just about service," he continued. "It was about respect. And that should never depend on the name on a reservation." His voice was even, but the truth behind it rippled through the room like an invisible current. Claire tried to look away but couldn't. The weight of her own reflection in his words held her still. She wanted to defend herself, to insist it was a misunderstanding, but the memory of her own tone, that polished cruelty, echoed too loudly in her mind. She blinked rapidly, eyes glistening, the tears she fought off not from remorse, but humiliation. Across the room, Vicky remained silent. Her son didn't need to look to know she was watching, not with pride, but with a quiet steadiness that had shaped him. Connor leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, voice dropping lower. "In my business, Claire, we build skyscrapers," he said. "Steel, glass, concrete. But the real foundation, it's people. And if you can't see the value in them, you have no business serving them." A murmur of agreement stirred among the guests, soft but undeniable. Claire lowered her gaze, her facade crumbling in the golden light. Connor sat back. The lesson delivered. No fury, no spectacle. Just truth. Precise, final, and impossible to unhear. Claire's voice broke before the words fully formed. I didn't know who she was," she stammered, her eyes darting between Connor and Vicky, desperate for an exit that didn't exist. The sound was small, stripped of all the authority she once wielded. The tray she still clutched trembled against her chest, a useless shield. Connor didn't move. His gaze, once calm, now sharpened to something colder, not anger, but disappointment. "That's exactly the problem," he said quietly. The restraint in his tone made it cut deeper than a shout ever could. "You didn't know who she was, so you assumed she was less." A collective silence fell again, heavy as marble. Somewhere near the bar, A guest shifted in their chair, the soft scrape of wood against tile echoing too loud in the stillness. Claire's mouth opened, but no sound came. Every excuse she might have crafted evaporated under the weight of the truth. And then Vicky spoke. Her voice was soft, so soft that at first it seemed it might be swallowed by the air. But it carried. It threaded through the room with quiet power, each syllable landing like a note in a symphony the world had forgotten how to hear. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is," she said, her gaze steady, "to treat them with grace." The words hung in the air, unadorned, perfect. Even the pianist, who'd been pretending to play to ease the tension, lowered his hands completely. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of reflection, shame, awakening. Connor turned slightly toward his mother, and for the first time that evening, his expression softened again. Pride shimmered faintly behind his composure, a recognition of the quiet strength that had raised him. The kind of strength that taught through grace, not rage. Claire's tears slipped free, tracing pale lines down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but even she knew the apology wasn't enough. It wasn't about her words. It was about what she hadn't seen, what she had refused to see. Vicky didn't reply. She simply nodded once, her eyes holding no malice, only understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but something gentler. Release. Around them, the guests sat motionless, humbled witnesses to something rare, not a scandal, not a spectacle, but a reckoning wrapped in grace. And as the piano resumed softly, hesitantly, the music felt changed, heavier, wiser, and touched by truth. Connor rose from his chair with unhurried precision, his presence drawing the room's attention as naturally as gravity. The murmurs that had begun in scattered corners quieted again, replaced by a heavy anticipation. He stood tall beside the table where his mother still sat, her expression calm, proud, composed. The faint reflection of the chandelier light shimmered across his suit as he looked out over the dining hall, meeting the eyes of the onlookers who had borne witness in silence. "For those of you watching," he began, his voice steady, deep, and deliberate, "take note." The sentence alone commanded stillness. He let it breathe before continuing. "Class isn't about where you sit," he said, glancing toward the gleaming tables and the nervous guests who occupied them. "It's about how you treat the person standing beside your table." No one moved. No one dared to look away. His words lingered in the air, weaving through the golden light and polished glass, settling heavy on the conscience of every soul in the room. The woman near the window who'd whispered earlier lowered her eyes. A man at the bar shifted, guilt flickering across his face. Even the hostess by the podium stood frozen, fingers clasped tightly in front of her. Connor turned his attention back to Claire, who stood pale and trembling near the service station. "Dinner's on the house tonight," he said, voice even, unflinching. Then his gaze moved to Marcus, whose chest rose and fell with quiet relief and admiration. "For everyone. And I'll personally review your staff's training manual tomorrow." Marcus nodded slowly, words failing him, his gratitude caught somewhere between respect and remorse. Around them, the atmosphere shifted again, but this time it was not discomfort that filled the space, but something closer to reckoning. Guests began to murmur softly, some in awe, others in shame. A few clapped, hesitant at first, then joined by others until the sound became a low, sincere rhythm that rolled through the dining hall. It wasn't applause for drama. It was recognition. Vicky looked up at her son, her expression unreadable except for the faintest glimmer in her eyes. Pride restrained, but radiant. Connor inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the quiet wave of gratitude and humility that followed. Then, without another word, he sat back down beside his mother. The pianist began to play again, slow, reverent, as if to give the evening a melody worthy of the truth it had just witnessed. The restaurant had emptied slowly, as if no one wanted to be the first to leave. Even now, hours later, Le Vieux Jardin carried the faint echo of the evening, soft clinks of silverware being cleared, the low hum of the city spilling in from the glass doors, and the lingering weight of something unspoken yet profound. The chandeliers had been dimmed to a warm amber glow, their light softening the sharp edges of what had transpired. The performance of luxury was over. What remained was something far more human. Vicky and Connor sat by the window, their table cleared except for 2 untouched cups of coffee growing cold between them. Outside, the Chicago skyline shimmered, each light a pulse in the heart of a city that never truly slept. Connor leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "You didn't tell me this happened before I got here," he said, his tone quieter now, stripped of the authority that had commanded the room earlier. Vicky's eyes softened as she looked at him, her reflection framed by the city lights. "You had to see it," she said. "Not for me. For them." Her words carried no bitterness, only understanding. Some lessons can't be explained. They have to be witnessed. Connor nodded slowly, his jaw flexing with thought. "You always taught me power isn't about proving yourself," he murmured. "It's about protecting what's right." She smiled faintly, reaching across the table to take his hand. Her fingers, elegant but calloused by years of work and restraint, closed gently around his. "And doing it with grace," she said. They sat in silence for a while, watching the city breathe beneath them. Down the street, a cab honked. Somewhere, a siren wailed faintly. The world had already begun to move on, the way it always did, but the memory of this night would remain etched in more than just the walls of that dining hall. Across the room, Eli quietly wiped down the last of the tables. He looked toward Vicky, his expression unreadable, then nodded once. A silent thank you from someone who had seen everything and would never forget it. Connor glanced at his mother one last time, admiration etched deep into his features. "You know," he said softly, "they'll talk about this." "Good," she replied, her voice steady. "Maybe next time, they'll think before they act." The final light from the chandelier caught her face, warm, golden, unwavering. Vicky Davis, the woman they tried to overlook, now glowed with the kind of grace that didn't need permission to be seen. Did you like this story? Share it. Someone out there has waited by a podium, heard the laughter, felt the sting of being told they didn't belong. Remind them that true class isn't measured by a name on a list. It's revealed in how you rise when the world looks away. Comment below if you've ever been dismissed, and let your grace do the talking. "Ma'am, you must be mistaken. There's no reservation in your name." The words weren't shouted. They didn't have to be. They floated through Le Vieux Jardin like perfume gone bitter, meant to be heard by the one woman standing too still to ignore them. Vicky Davis smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hid a lifetime of practiced restraint. Let them wonder, let them whisper, because she knew something they didn't. Grace outlasts ignorance every single time. The maître d' stalled, the hostess hesitated, and for a moment the room exhaled superiority. But when the glass doors opened and the man they all revered walked straight to her table, called her mom, and kissed her cheek, silence fell like judgment. Stay with us, because what begins as a dismissal over dinner ends as a lesson in dignity. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Le Vieux Jardin shimmered with understated luxury, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Golden sconces painted the walls in amber light, and crystal glassware gleamed beneath soft jazz that floated like perfume through the air. The scent of seared scallops and saffron butter lingered just enough to make patrons close their eyes with pleasure. Conversations hummed, low and moneyed, the sound of people confident in their place in the world. And then the door opened, and for a brief second, every gaze in the room shifted. Vicky Davis stepped inside, her posture elegant, her movements measured. Her skin carried the warm radiance of mahogany polished by time, her hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. The ivory blouse she wore was simple but pristine, her pearl earrings small but unmistakably real. She didn't need labels or logos to command attention. Her dignity did that for her. Still, attention in a place like this came with edges. Heads turned, then quickly turned away. The maître d', a young man with perfect hair and a thinner smile, glanced at her with the reflex of someone trying to decide if she'd made a wrong turn. Vicky offered a polite smile. "Reservation for Davis," she said. Her voice carried warmth, the kind that made people either soften or flinch depending on what they saw when they looked at her. The maître d' hesitated, eyes flicking to the screen in front of him. "Of course," he murmured, though his tone said he wasn't sure. "Just a moment." She nodded and stepped aside, her clutch in hand. She wasn't here for attention or validation. Tonight was celebration. Her son, her boy who once stayed up studying by candlelight when the power was cut off, had become CEO of King Enterprises, the youngest in the company's history. It was the kind of victory that could fill a room, but Vicky carried it quietly, the way she'd carried everything, with grace, not pride. Still, the waiting felt different. A couple near the window looked her way and whispered. A hostess passed her twice without meeting her eyes. Vicky folded her hands and straightened her spine. She'd learned long ago that some rooms only saw color before character. But she also knew that grace could be its own armor. Behind her, laughter swelled. A champagne cork popped. The maître d' didn't return. Yet Vicky stayed calm, her expression unshaken, her gaze steady on the candlelight flickering across the marble. She didn't belong here, they thought, but soon they would learn just how wrong they were. Claire Whitman moved like a blade through silk, precise, efficient, impossible to soften. Her black uniform fit her like armor, crisp and tailored to perfection, the white collar starched to a point that could cut. Every movement she made carried the quiet confidence of someone who believed she'd earned her place in a world built for refinement. Her dark hair was pulled back in a twist that never loosened, not even after a 12-hour shift. She wasn't cruel by nature, just practiced at the kind of indifference that passed for professionalism. Standards, she called it. Some might call it superiority. When she spotted Vicky still waiting by the podium, she paused. A black woman alone, in ivory and pearls, holding herself like she belonged in a room most people had to beg to enter. Something in that picture unsettled her. She adjusted the tray in her hands and approached with a smile that was all surface. "Good evening," she said, her tone honeyed but hollow. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight." Her eyes flicked briefly to the near-empty dining room, then back to Vicky, daring her to question it. Vicky didn't flinch. "I have a reservation," she said, her voice even and kind. "Under Davis." For a heartbeat, Claire considered pretending to check. But old habits, ugly ones, moved faster. Her smile thinned. "I don't think so," she murmured, glancing over Vicky's shoulder as though already finished with the conversation. She shifted her weight and walked away, leaving behind a faint trail of expensive perfume and something sharper, dismissal. Vicky stood still, her hand tightening slightly on her clutch. She'd been here before. Not this restaurant, not this night, but this moment. The quiet reminder that to some people, dignity without a title looked like defiance. A hostess at the corner caught her eye and quickly looked down, pretending to polish menus. A couple at the bar exchanged glances, pretending not to notice. The world had perfected the art of pretending. Still, Vicky didn't let the silence own her. She inhaled slowly, her face composed, her voice calm. "Excuse me," she said to the hostess. "Perhaps you could double-check?" "The name is Davis." It was a simple request, spoken gently, but it landed with weight. For all her poise, Vicky wasn't someone to be erased. And though Claire didn't turn back, a ripple of unease passed through the room. The kind that comes when people realize they might have just misjudged the wrong woman. The room hummed with the soft unease that follows an unspoken offense. No one said a word, but the shift was palpable, like a draft slipping through a sealed window. Forks paused mid-air, conversations lowered to murmurs. A man in a silver suit leaned closer to his date, whispering something that made her glance toward Vicky, then look quickly away. The pianist, sensing the tension like static in the air, let his fingers drift into softer chords, the melody thinning until it felt like background noise to something heavier. Vicky felt it all, the glances, the silence, the scrutiny that wasn't loud, but loud enough. Her back remained straight, her shoulders drawn with the composure of someone who'd been trained by years of invisible wars. She'd stood in boardrooms where her ideas were repeated by men who took the credit, in boutiques where clerks shadowed her steps, in offices where security guards double-checked her badge. This was no different. The choreography of dismissal was always the same. She lifted her chin slightly, eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight at the nearest table. Her reflection shimmered in the polished glass of the wine cabinet beside her, poised, elegant, unmoved. She could have left. She could have demanded to see the manager. But instead, she waited, because walking away would give them what they wanted. The confirmation that she didn't belong. At the back of the room, a young busboy named Eli hovered near the side station, polishing silverware with trembling hands. He couldn't stop glancing at her. Something about the way she stood, still but unbroken, reminded him of his mother waiting at a welfare office when he was 9, chin high despite the stares. He didn't understand much about privilege or prejudice, but he knew the look of quiet strength when he saw it. It unsettled him that no one else did. Claire swept past, catching Eli's hesitation. "Eyes on your work," she snapped under her breath. But her voice betrayed a flicker of guilt she didn't care to name. She didn't like what she saw in Vicky because it reflected something she'd buried, shame disguised as pride. Vicky's gaze met Eli's for half a second, a silent exchange of humanity in a room determined to ignore it. And in that brief connection, the balance of the evening shifted. She was no longer invisible, not to everyone. And sometimes, that was how change began, with one person refusing to look away. Vicky had waited long enough. Her patience wasn't born from weakness, but from choice, a discipline learned in rooms where being the only black woman meant walking a constant line between dignity and defiance. She stepped toward the podium, her calm presence cutting through the hum of conversation. "Excuse me," she said gently, addressing the hostess who still avoided her eyes. "May I speak to the manager?" The hostess hesitated, glancing toward Claire, who stood nearby with a tray balanced on one palm and irritation flickering in her eyes. Claire let out a soft, theatrical sigh. "There's really no need to bother him," she said, her tone sugared but sharp. "We're quite busy tonight." Her gaze swept over the half-empty dining room, daring anyone to contradict her. Vicky didn't raise her voice. "Then he's busy with me," she replied, her expression unchanging. Moments later, Marcus Lee emerged from the kitchen corridor, wiping his hands on a white towel. His tie hung slightly loose, the telltale sign of a man balancing too much for too long. His expression softened when he saw her. Something in her composure demanded respect before a word was spoken. "Good evening, ma'am. How can I help?" Before Vicky could respond, Claire cut in. "She doesn't have a reservation, sir," she said quickly, shifting her weight like a child trying to get ahead of trouble. Marcus frowned, pulling out the reservation tablet. His finger scrolled down the list until he froze. "There's a table here," he murmured, "under D. King." He looked up, puzzled. "That's one of our VIP bookings." Vicky met his gaze with a quiet smile. "Yes, that's me." The words fell softly, but they struck with the force of truth. The air changed. Claire blinked, her face flickering between disbelief and discomfort. "That's impossible," she muttered, a small laugh catching in her throat like a reflex. Marcus straightened, the weight of realization settling in. "My apologies, Ms. Davis," he said sincerely. "Right this way, please." He guided her toward the corner table near the window, the one framed by soft light and a view of the glittering city skyline. It was a seat reserved for power, and tonight, it belonged to her. Vicky moved with grace, each step a quiet victory. Claire stood frozen, her cheeks tightening with something that wasn't quite embarrassment. It was envy, laced with disbelief. As Vicky sat, the pianist shifted to a new melody, smooth and deliberate, as if the room itself had decided to correct its posture. The shift was immediate. It began as a murmur, soft as silk brushing over marble, but within seconds the sound spread through Le Vieux Jardin like a rising tide. Heads turned discreetly at first, then less so. "Who is she?" someone whispered over the rim of a champagne glass. "Did she say king?" The question lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Around here, the name carried gravity. The King Group wasn't just a company. It was an empire that had rewritten Chicago's skyline. Real estate, technology, philanthropy. Their reach was everywhere, and the thought that the woman now seated by the window might be part of that legacy set the room humming with curiosity. Marcus had returned to his post, subtly checking that everything about Vicky's table was immaculate. Fresh candles, the finest crystal, even the napkin folded with care. It was the kind of treatment reserved for politicians and media moguls. And yet Vicky, with her quiet poise and gentle smile, looked perfectly at home. She didn't gloat, didn't scan the room to see who was watching. She simply rested her hands on the table, the pearls at her ears catching the candlelight, as though she'd been sitting there all along. Claire hovered nearby, her tray tucked tight against her chest. She could feel the stares grazing her back, the whispers threading together, small, sharp reminders that she had misstepped. Every sound, every flicker of attention toward Vicky made her jaw tighten a little more. To her, it wasn't about race or name or wealth, not consciously at least. It was about being proven wrong in public. And that, to someone like Claire, was unbearable. She pretended to busy herself with another table, but her eyes kept drifting toward Vicky's calm figure by the window. The other staff were whispering now too. The hostess, the busboy, even the sommelier. Eli passed by with a tray of empty glasses, his gaze flicking toward Vicky before meeting Claire's. His expression was quiet but knowing, as if he'd seen something she hadn't. It irritated her more than she cared to admit. "Focus," she muttered, though the word was mostly for herself. When Marcus gestured for someone to take Vicky's order, Claire stepped forward before anyone else could volunteer. "I'll handle it," she said smoothly, masking her bitterness beneath a practiced smile. She needed to reclaim control, to remind herself of her authority. But as she picked up her notepad and turned toward that table, something darker flickered behind her composure. The next chance to prove a point had come, and Claire intended to take it. Claire approached the table with the grace of a performer stepping back into her act. The tray balanced perfectly on her palm, the crisp linen over her arm concealing the tension coiled beneath her skin. Her heels clicked softly against the marble as she stopped just short of Vicky's table, letting the pause stretch long enough to reassert control. "Good evening again," she said, her tone bright and practiced. "May I offer you our wine list?" She placed the leather-bound menu delicately on the table, then hesitated, a pause too intentional to be missed. "Or perhaps," she added lightly, "you'd prefer to see the casual options." From behind the polished tray, she pulled out a smaller menu, the kind reserved for less discerning guests, the simple list, as the staff called it. Her smile was honeyed, but her words dripped with quiet venom. "Some of our guests find these selections a little more approachable." Vicky looked up, her gaze calm, her expression unreadable. The candlelight reflected in her dark eyes, steady and composed. "I'll stick with this one," she said softly, resting her fingertips on the full wine list. Her voice carried no edge, no anger, only grace that somehow made the insult sharper. "Thank you." For a fraction of a second, Claire's composure faltered. Something about the stillness in Vicky's response, the refusal to meet cruelty with anything but dignity, felt like a mirror she didn't want to face. She forced a smile, the corners of her mouth tightening. "Of course," she murmured, gathering her tray like a shield. As she turned away, Marcus watched from across the room, his eyes narrowing. He had seen everything, the pause, the tone, the insult dressed in civility. He knew Claire. She'd been with the restaurant for years, trained to perfection but hardened by pride. He also knew the difference between service and spite. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move yet. Vicky, meanwhile, lifted the wine list and began to read, her serenity undisturbed. Around her, the restaurant had resumed its rhythm. Soft laughter, silverware clinking, the piano whispering through the air. But beneath that surface, tension lingered like a shadow. Then the door at the far end of the dining room opened. The maître d' straightened, the hostess froze mid-step, and a ripple of attention passed through the room. A tall man had just entered, broad-shouldered, poised, the kind of presence that quieted conversation without asking. The glass doors swung shut behind him, catching a glint of city lights across his tailored suit. Marcus's breath caught as he recognized him. And at table 12, Vicky Davis finally smiled, as if she'd been expecting him all along. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.